The sun rose over Colonel Abilio Ramos's lands, as it had always risen. Slowly, heavily, as if even the light was afraid to wake that man. The colonel was the type who measured everything in alquires and sacks of coffee. He had a thick mustache, small eyes, and a voice the size of thunder. Men took off their hats when he passed, not out of respect, but out of fear. There was a huge difference between the two things, although the colonel had never learned to distinguish them. His daughter, Beatriz, was as different from him as the flower is different from the thorn that guards it. She was 22 years old, with dark hair and a way of laughing that made the birds in the yard take flight in surprise. But what caught the most attention about her was not her beauty, it was her strength, a quiet strength that did not shout, but did not yield. Every morning, while her father was still sleeping, she would go down to the back gate of the farm, from where one could see the small coffee property of the young Ernesto. Ernesto was 26 years old, with calloused hands from someone who worked the land with his own fingers and a heart big enough to hold the whole world. It was not rich. He only had 18 alquires inherited from his father, who had died early, and a promise made at that bedside. He would care for the land with honor. The love between the two had been born 3 years earlier, when she escaped through the back gate, and he found her under a jabaticaba tree, crying because her father had torn up a letter she had written. Ernesto did not ask why. He simply sat beside her and said, "Cry as much as you need. I'll stay here. I'll stay." Since that afternoon, they would meet whenever they could, exchange words between the wire fences, and look at each other from afar when the world would not allow more. And Ernesto had asked for her hand in the only way he knew, with honesty. "I don't have much. I have the land, the work, and my heart. If that is enough, tell me." "It is more than enough," she answered, without hesitating for a second. But neither of them had yet spoken to the colonel. It was on a Monday in August that Ernesto, with his hat in his hands and his heart in his throat, knocked on the big door of the farm. The colonel received him on the veranda, sitting in the leather chair he had ordered made especially to look like a throne. He listened to the young man speak. He let the silence last longer than it should have. Then he opened a smile that had nothing joyful about it. "How many alquires do you have, boy?" 18, sir. "And the coffee looks good this year." 18. The colonel stood up slowly. "I have was raised in a house with 100 windows. Do you think she will be happy on 18 alquires of hope?" Ernesto did not lower his eyes. "With all due respect, sir, happiness does not live in alquires. You may go, boy." Ernesto left, not with his head down, but with his chest tight, in a way he had never felt before. That same night, Beatriz learned from the cook Dana Filomena, a woman who knew everything before it happened, that her father had refused Ernesto, and she learned, with a chill in her stomach, that the colonel had already sent word to 3 wealthy families in the region. 3 days later, he announced in the big room, with the solemnity of someone proclaiming a law, "Beatriz will marry well. In 30 days, each suitor will present his dowry, land, cattle, gold, whatever he has. Whoever offers the most wins her hand." Beatriz stood looking at her father for a long time. "Are you selling a daughter or negotiating a head of cattle? I'm guaranteeing your future. Girl, you're guaranteeing your pride." The colonel slammed his hand on the table. The dishes trembled. Dona Filomena, behind the kitchen door, clutched her apron with both fists. Beatriz did not cry. She went to her room, closed the door carefully, and stood looking out the window toward the hillside where Ernesto's farm was. She knew what was coming. She knew she would not yield, but she also knew that Ernesto, with his 18 alquires, had no way to win a war of money. What she did not know was that Ernesto had already decided he would not fight with money, and it was that decision that changed everything. The 3 suitors were men made in the image of what the colonel admired: thick wallets, too much land, and too little sense of humor. Tobias Guedes, 51 years old, widowed twice, but no one asked too many questions about the two widows. Looked at Beatriz as if she were an item on a shopping list. Ramiro Feliciano, 38 years old, fat and loud, would enter a room and the space would become smaller. Benedito Asunción, 30 years old, and Palit actually needed the colonel's farm to save his own. He was competing for the dowry in reverse. Ernesto learned of the competition on the same day as was to be expected in the countryside. Through the blacksmith's son, who heard it at the store, who heard it from a farmhand, who heard it from who knows where. He stood still under a coffee tree for a long time. His two employees, the brothers Dito and Zacharias, stood beside him without knowing what to say. It was Dito who spoke first. "Boss, are you going to enter this dispute?" "I am." "With what?" asked Zacharias. "With all the sincerity in the world. You don't even have half of what these guys have." Ernesto looked at the two of them and said something they would never forget as long as they lived. "I know. That's why I'm not going to compete for the dowry. I'm going to compete for her heart. And her heart is already mine. I just need her father to realize it." "And how?" Dito scratched his head. "With my hands, not with money." Zacharias looked at his brother. His brother looked at Zacharias. "All right," said Zacharias, "but if it goes wrong, it's not our fault." The month of the dispute was the longest in Beatriz's life. Tobias appeared every day with jewelry and promises, speaking to her as if she were already his. Ramiro sent enormous letters written by a secretary, full of words that held no truth. Once he brought musicians who played on the veranda for 2 hours. The colonel loved it. Beatriz had a headache until the next day. Benedito was the only one who tried an honest conversation. One afternoon, he looked at her and said in a low voice, "I know you don't want any of us. Then why are you here?" "Because I need to. But that's no excuse. Forgive me." Beatriz did not answer. He was the only one of the three for whom she felt something close to pity. Ernesto, meanwhile, was doing something no one expected. Every morning, before sunrise, he was on someone's property in the community, without warning, without charging, without asking for recognition. He fixed the school roof that had been leaking into the classrooms for months. He helped old Mr. Antonio fence the pasture. He cleaned the Pacheco family's pond. He took supplies to the widow Donna Generasa, who was raising 5 grandchildren alone. He did it and left. But people saw, in the countryside, what people see, people talk about. It was Donna Felamina who passed every story on to Beatriz. Every day, a new tale. The school repaired. Mr. Antonio, with eyes full of tears. Not knowing the name of the boy who showed up at 6 in the morning with tools in hand. Donna Generasa, praying on her knees in gratitude. Beatriz cried alone in her room at night, not from sadness, from love. The kind that hurts because it is too big to fit only in the chest. In the 3rd week, something happened that no one had foreseen. Tito's son, a 5-year-old boy named Josu, fell ill with a high fever. It was late at night, heavy rain, and the doctor was 2 hours away on a dirt road. Ernesto did not think twice. He mounted his horse and rode into the rain. He arrived at the doctor's house at midnight, soaked from hat to boot. The doctor, an old man named Dr. Roque, tired of the world, opened the door with a closed face. "Do you have money to pay?" Ernesto put his hand in his pocket. It was little. The doctor made a gesture of contempt. Ernesto stood still for a second. Then he said, with a calm that cut through, "Sir, this boy is 5 years old and has had a high fever for hours. If you won't come for money, come for humanity. And if you won't come for either, tell me now so I can go find another doctor, because I'm not leaving without help." Dr. Roque looked at that soaked young man, standing firm as a stake in the storm, and something in him gave way. "Wait, while I get my bag." Josu survived. The next morning, Dito hugged Ernesto for longer than could be explained by gratitude alone. Zacharias stood to the side, trying not to cry and failing completely. Ernesto gave both a pat and went to tend to the coffee as if nothing had happened. Colonel Bilio learned of the story still that morning. He sat on the veranda, quieter than usual, looking at the land like someone reviewing a calculation he had gotten wrong. Donna Filomena passed by with the coffee and, for the first time in years, could not guess what the boss was thinking. 1 week remained until the end of the dispute, when Beatriz entered her father's room hidden, without asking permission. "Father, I need to speak with you." He looked at her. "I know you want the best for me. I know you were raised believing that the best a father can give his daughter is security. Land, name, money. I understand that." She took a deep breath. "But you never asked me what security means to me." Silence. "Security for me is knowing that the man by my side will not look at me as property. It is knowing that if I get sick, he will ride his horse in the pouring rain at dawn. It is knowing that he treats the farmhand with the same respect he treats the landowner. Ernesto is that man. Father. And you know it." The colonel stood looking at her for a long time. "You challenge me in my own house." "No. I'm talking to my father. There's..." Abilio went to the window and stood with his back to her, looking at the land. For a moment, Beatriz saw in him something she had never seen. A tired man who had confused respect with fear his entire life. But he said nothing, and she left without knowing what would come next. What she did not know was that the colonel remained at that window for much longer than she imagined. The last day of the dispute arrived on a Thursday with an open sky, the kind that makes the red earth shine as if it had just been created. The colonel had summoned the suitors to the big veranda. There was coffee, cornmeal cake, made by Donna Fil, and the tension of those who know something is about to happen, but don't quite know what. Beatriz stayed in her room until the last moment. The old cook knocked on the door. "They're all there, miss." "Ernesto, too." "I know, Filomena. He's wearing that old wide-brimmed hat. Some people don't need a tie to look like real people." Beatriz gave a sad smile. "Go there and defend me if my father gets angry." "I will. With this frying pan if necessary." On the veranda, the 3 suitors presented their dowries. Tobias placed on the table 50 alquiers of land, an envelope of gold, and a catalyst long enough to impress anyone. He spoke as if the conversation was already over. Ramiro presented deeds, jewelry, and a loud promise of a new house. He smiled the whole time with the smile of someone who had practiced in the mirror. Benedito placed his documents in silence and said only, "It's everything I have," and sat down. The colonel looked satisfied. It was exactly the scene he had imagined. Then Ernesto stood up. He had not brought an envelope, deed, or jewelry. In his hands he held only an old notebook with a faded blue cover and edges worn from being opened so many times. Tobias snorted. Ramiro laughed, with his mouth closed. Some neighbors exchanged glances. The colonel frowned. "What is this, boy?" "It is my dowry, sir." "A notebook?" "Yes." Ernesto opened it to the first page with care, as if opening something sacred. Here are noted, day by day, all the services I provided in this community in the last month. School repaired, pond cleaned, fence built, firewood cut for. Wood, one night in the rain to save a child. These are not alquires, Colonel. These are the days of my life. It is what I have to give, and I will always have this to give. The silence that followed was the kind that weighs, that occupies space, and makes everyone stay quiet without knowing why. Ernesto closed the notebook and looked straight at the colonel. You want to give your daughter to a man who has much. Primera on her stand. But I came to ask something else. Do you want to give your daughter to a man who gives much? Because I don't know how to accumulate, but I know how to give, and I will give everything I have, every day of my life, to Beatriz, and to any children God gives us. Tobias stood up with a grimace. Colonel, is this a joke? This boy came with an old notebook to compete with land deeds. Sit down, Tobias. The colonel's voice was different. Quieter. Deeper, Abilio. looked at Ernesto, then at the three suitors, then at the veranda door where Beatriz stood, unnoticed by anyone, with eyes full of tears and a firm chin. Mother and daughter, and in that looked past everything. The years of silence, his pride, her courage, and the enormous longing for a relationship that had forgotten to be affection amid so much power. The colonel took a deep breath and said, in a voice no one there had ever heard before, the voice of a true father, "Beatriz, come here." She crossed the veranda slowly. "Do you want this man?" "Yes, father." "Are you sure?" "I am more sure of this than of anything else in my life." The colonel remained silent. Then he looked at Ernesto. "Boy, you have 18 alquires." "I do, sir. I have 300. But in 30 days you did what I didn't do in 30 years in this community. My father always said that a man of value is one who serves. I forgot that along the way." He extended his hand to Ernesto. "Will you take care of my daughter?" Ernesto shook that hand with both of his. "With everything I have and everything I am. Every day of my life." Donna Filomena, in the crack of the kitchen window, let a sob escape that she tried to disguise as a sneeze that fooled no one. Tito and Zacarias, leaning on the gate without invitation, hugged each other without shame. Zacarias tried to speak. He couldn't. Tito didn't even try. Beatriz walked over to Ernesto, and he needed no further ceremony. The colonel stood watching the two and felt, for the first time in a long time, perhaps in his entire life, a pride that was not of possession. It was the pride of a father. The wedding took place 3 months later, on a morning with a sky so blue it seemed created especially for that day. It was not a grand party. It was a true party, which is much better. There was Donna Filomena's cornmeal cake, made with a dedication that rivaled the colonel's on his best days. There was Dito's accordion, which played so well that people danced without realizing they were already dancing. There was Zacarias' loud joy, who danced until he could no more, and tried a little more anyway. At the end of the party, Ernesto approached his father-in-law with 2 glasses of lemonade. "Thank you, sir." "For what?" "I almost got everything wrong, but you didn't." Ernesto sat beside the old man without ceremony, and that counts for a lot. "You're too stubborn, you know. I learned from someone who also has a hard head, father-in-law." The colonel gave a real laugh, the kind that comes from deep down and surprises even the one laughing. The years that followed were the kind life rarely gives for free. There were droughts and plagues on the coffee, nights of worry. There were arguments that ended in hugs, and moments when each looked at the other thinking, "It was harder than I imagined." And then they looked again and thought, "And I would do it again." Colonel Abilio visited every week until the last year of his life, and in his last conversations with his daughter, always sighed, "You were braver than I was my whole life." And she always replied, "You had courage too, father. It just came later." And it came when the colonel died. It was Ernesto who stayed by his side, holding his hand, and the old man left with a smile on his face. We live in a world that taught us that a person's value is measured by what they possess, that love is proven with gold, that respect is bought with land. But every time someone gives up their own sleep to save a child in the rain, every time a heart chooses to give instead of accumulate, the world becomes a little closer to what it should have been from the beginning. The richest dowry that exists does not fit in a deed. It fits in an attitude, in a hug, in a choice. You don't need to have much to be worth much. You need to be much for those around you. If today you are in a dispute where others have more, where the cards seem stacked against you, where the world insists on measuring you by things you do not have, remember Ernesto. He did not win with what he had. He won with what he was. And remember Beatriz, who did not let herself be sold even when the world tried to put a price on her. And remember the colonel, because it is never too late to open your hand, open your heart, and truly be who you should have been before. The greatest dowry that exists is a pair of hands that work, a heart that serves, and the courage to stay when staying is difficult. If this story touched your heart, Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and leave in the comments. I choose to give my hand, my heart, and my best every day. Share with someone who needs to hear today that true love has no price, but is worth absolutely everything. Until the next story, with affection and faith.